Welcome back. Our previous episode explored the specific educational mechanisms that create Jewish intellectual advantages. We discovered how early socialization and systematic practices generate superior cognitive development through what we called cognitive multipliers. Today, we'll examine how these educational advantages translate into measurable differences in achievement. We'll analyze comprehensive statistical data comparing different educational and cultural systems. This analysis will reveal remarkable patterns that help explain contemporary geopolitical phenomena we discussed in our opening episode. Mental attitudes formed by different systematic approaches largely determine the most important psychological characteristics of various communities. The modern world provides measurable data about these differences. Among scientists worldwide, only 1% come from Islamic communities. This represents a striking disproportion when we consider that Islamic populations constitute over 20% of global population. In Israel, there are more scientists than in the entire Muslim world. This comparison becomes even more remarkable when we consider population differences. Israel has approximately 8 million people. The Islamic world exceeds 1.5 billion. In Arab countries, about 330 foreign books are translated annually. This is 5 times less than in Greece alone. Greece has a population of approximately 10 million people. The entire Arab world exceeds 400 million. Islamic countries spend on average 0.3% of their gross national product on scientific research. This is 8 times less than the world average. Countries with advanced economies typically invest 2 to 3% of GDP in research and development. According to World Bank data, the total export of Arab countries, excluding oil and gas, is inferior to the export of Finland. Finland has a population of approximately 5.5 million people. The Arab world exceeds 400 million. These statistics reveal systematic patterns rather than random variations. They suggest fundamental differences in educational and intellectual frameworks. In this regard, an interesting example illustrates these patterns. The founders of modern Arabic press, particularly the Cairo newspaper Al-Ahram, which became the leading publication of the Arab world, were Syrian and Lebanese Christians. This pattern extends beyond journalism. In many fields requiring systematic education and analytical thinking, non-Muslim minorities within Islamic societies often achieve disproportionate influence and success. The problem of intellectual development in Islamic communities manifests in several measurable ways. Unlike other systematic traditions, Islamic societies lack unified hierarchical educational structures. They lack clearly formulated intellectual frameworks. They lack strategic approaches to systematic knowledge development. Islamic educational systems give rise to numerous but disconnected currents and groups. According to researchers, approximately 4 different spiritual administrations operate in Russia alone. This fragmentation prevents coordinated intellectual development. According to experts, attempts to find common educational denominators across Islamic trends prove futile. There are no comparative standards of intellectual achievement between different Islamic educational approaches. The issue of systematic development is illustrated by observations that the positive creative potential of Islamic communities in social, spiritual, cultural, educational, and political life remains poorly realized. It has insufficient influence on progressive development and strengthening of institutional foundations. At the same time, we find works that discuss Islamic intellectual potential with different interpretations of its foundations. Some scholars assert that there are three bases for intellectual development at the civilizational level: cultural and historical tradition, external influences from other societies, and self-identification of communities living in diverse environments. However, such approaches suffer from a fundamental flaw. They do not account for the genetic and foundational connection with the educational and systematic essence of Islamic intellectual frameworks. What explains these measurable differences? The answer lies in understanding how different educational traditions create different cognitive capabilities. Jewish educational traditions emphasize several key elements: early intellectual responsibility through adolescent maturity requirements, universal literacy requirements for all community members, systematic interpretation and debate practices, multilingual competency development, integration of analytical and empathetic thinking approaches. These practices create compound advantages. Each educational element reinforces others. Early responsibility enables deeper learning. Universal literacy creates shared knowledge foundations. Public interpretation develops communication skills. Multilingual competency creates cognitive flexibility. Islamic educational traditions emphasize different elements: memorization of sacred texts rather than interpretation, respect for established authority rather than questioning and debate, unified community identity rather than individual intellectual development, practical religious observance rather than analytical thinking. These differences create measurable outcomes. Jewish communities consistently produce scientific discoveries and innovations disproportionate to population size. Islamic communities, despite vastly larger populations, produce proportionally fewer intellectual achievements. The disparity becomes even more striking when we consider resource availability. Many Islamic countries possess enormous natural wealth through oil and gas revenues. Yet this material advantage does not translate into intellectual or scientific achievement. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have vast financial resources, yet they cannot produce internationally recognized scientists or engineers. Their scientific and technical personnel are educated primarily in universities of the United States, Britain, or Western Europe. All advanced equipment and technologies in Arab countries are imported. They are installed and maintained by personnel trained in Western educational systems. This creates dependency rather than indigenous capability. Despite enormous financial resources, Islamic societies remain consumers rather than producers of advanced knowledge and technology. The statistical patterns suggest systematic rather than accidental causes. Educational traditions that emphasize memorization over interpretation, authority over questioning, conformity over innovation, consistently produce different cognitive outcomes. These differences help explain geopolitical patterns we discussed in our opening episode. Small countries with educational traditions that emphasize analytical thinking and systematic innovation can achieve influence far exceeding their population size. Large countries with educational traditions that emphasize different values remain dependent on external sources for advanced knowledge and technology. This analysis is not about inherent capability or cultural superiority. It is about systematic educational practices and their measurable consequences over extended periods. Different educational approaches create different cognitive advantages. Communities that emphasize early intellectual responsibility, universal literacy, systematic interpretation, and analytical thinking consistently produce different outcomes than communities that emphasize memorization, authority, and conformity. In our next episode, we'll examine how these educational differences relate to fundamental approaches to knowledge and reality. We'll explore 3 different monotheistic traditions and their distinct intellectual frameworks. How do different approaches to ultimate questions create different types of thinking and problem solving? What can we learn from comparing these systematic approaches? If you're interested in how educational traditions create measurable civilizational differences, subscribe to the channel, in comments, share examples of how different educational approaches in various societies create distinct intellectual outcomes. See you next episode, where we'll explore 3 monotheisms and their contrasting intellectual frameworks.
Welcome back. Our previous episode analyzed comprehensive statistical data comparing different educational and cultural systems. We discovered remarkable patterns that help explain contemporary geopolitical phenomena through measurable differences in intellectual achievement. Today, we'll examine the fundamental frameworks that create these differences. We'll explore 3 monotheistic traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and their contrasting approaches to knowledge and reality. This analysis will reveal how different conceptions of the divine-human relationship create fundamentally different types of thinking and problem-solving. Islam represents one of 3 monotheistic traditions that have systematic character. They affirm eternal truths. They profess a single divine absolute. But in views on the relationship of people with the spiritual sphere, there are cardinal differences between these systems. These differences form the basis for significant mental variations among large populations. Historically, the first monotheistic tradition, Judaism, professes that humanity was created in the divine image and likeness. This determines the unconditional primacy of humanity in the world, and power among all created things. All communications of the divine in the Old Testament are personal in nature. The divine in Judaism is not a concept, not an abstraction, not an idea, but a living person. At the same time, Judaism professes a community identity, the identity of Israel, which as a holistic entity, the people of Israel, stands before the absolute divine. Simultaneously, the divine in Judaism has neither a body nor an image by definition, and cannot be represented in any form or concrete personality. Although Moses, according to tradition, encountered the divine, he experienced this only in the form of an angel. The essence of the divine in Judaism remains inaccessible to human vision. Nevertheless, the very personality of the divine is embodied in a single chosen people. This further emphasizes the significance of a special community personal principle in Judaism. This systematic approach determines extraordinary adaptability, tribal solidarity, internal cohesion, communal autonomy, national corporate kinship, continuity and integrity of all Jews, both in spatial and historical temporal aspects. Thinking strategies and behavioral features of Jews are determined by the essence of their systematic approach, which they express regardless of place and time. For this reason, Judaism, even without having its own territorial state for extended periods, has always been not only a unique community super-subject of politics, but a powerful influence in political systems throughout the world. Christianity professes the incarnate divine, revealed in the real person of Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. This divine, who reveals himself to humanity, is the creator of the surrounding world. He is one, absolute and transcendental. He exists outside the world, and is not reducible to any things. In human history, this systematic approach appeared as the beginning and foundation of qualitatively new individual subjective, creative thinking. This began to be established in the 4th century in connection with the victory of Christianity in the Roman Empire, confessing such divine as the very essence of belief. A Christian does not recognize his original conditioning by the natural order of things. This is a necessary consequence of the transcendence and creative approach. According to Christian teaching, this absolute transcendental divine was incarnate in humanity. This means that it was not some natural energy, cosmic emanation, force, or thought that overshadowed humanity, but the absolute and transcendental divine standing outside of nature. He was in the world, and the world through him began to be. The whole world began to be from the divine human, who enlightens every person who comes into the world. This is why modern humanity, whether believing or not, but living in the 1,000-year space of Christian mentality, perceives itself as individual and unique subjects, as something self-evident. All this despite the fact that in nature, in the cosmos, in everything that surrounds us, there are not and have not been any natural foundations for the emergence of individual subjects and the formation of subjective thinking. Thus, thinking in Judaism and Christianity is not only inherently systematic, since it asserts itself without any evidence, but it is also subjective. It is based on the communication of the transcendental, absolute divine, the creator of heaven and earth, of everything visible and invisible. Since its inception in the 7th century, Islam has also professed a single transcendental, absolute, but at the same time abstract divine, fundamentally not related to human personality, to the community or individual subject. If in Christianity the person of Jesus is the word of the divine, who came incarnate into this world, then in Islam, on the contrary, the divine is systematically given the attribute of a book, the Holy Quran. It should be emphasized that in Islam, the divine is neither a person nor a subject. At the same time, the word of the divine is the Quran, its text and content. Islam rejects the idea of ontological transformation of humanity through acquisition of personality in the divine human. Islamic doctrine, recognizing and honoring the prophets Ibrahim, Yaqub, Musa, Daud outside the context of Jewish systematic approach, denies the exclusivity of the people of Israel. Islam also recognizes the historical tradition of Christ as a real person, whom the Arabs called Isa ben Maryam, but does this outside of its divine human meaning, denying Christianity the reality of the incarnation of Jesus. A Muslim cannot imagine that the Lord has a son, who is equal to him in greatness and power. Islam does not recognize that Jesus Christ, who was manifested in the flesh, already by his birth stands above Muhammad himself. All the prophets prophesied by the action of the Lord himself, by his action from above. They prophesied from the Almighty and omnipresent Divine himself, proclaimed the truth by the Spirit of the Divine himself, being guided by the Holy Spirit of the Lord. But according to the Quran, Muhammad was not honored with the appearance of the divine. did not communicate with the Almighty Creator who created the world, did not speak with the Creator of the universe, the Almighty of the world did not reveal himself as, for example, to Moses. Instead of conversing with the divine, Muhammad allegedly communicated with Gabriel. The path of the appearance of Jibril, and not the Lord of the world himself, is called the straight path. According to the Quran, there is no more direct path than the appearance of a messenger angel, instead of the most eternal, omnipresent and almighty, beginningless and infinite divine, who created world, who created humanity and all angels. Thus, the systematic approach of Islam emphasizes the possibility of Muhammad as the best of people only to convey the word of the divine, but not to embody the divine himself. Only in Islam, and quite specifically in Sunnism, a practically insurmountable boundary is drawn between humanity and the divine. It is in this that the fundamental difference of Islam is manifested, on the basis of which completely different systematic subjectless thinking was formed in the Islamic mentality, unlike that of Judaism and Christianity. Of all the monotheistic mentalities, Islam is absolutely subjectless. Thus, Islam excludes any real correlation between humanity and the divine, presented both in the chosen people of Israel and in the personality of a Christian. In Islam, humanity is not created in the image and likeness of the divine, and in his own appearance and image. The subjectivity of the divine does not make sense. These fundamental differences in conception of the divine-human relationship create measurably different cognitive and cultural outcomes. Judaism emphasizes community identity combined with analytical interpretation. Christianity emphasizes individual subjectivity combined with creative transformation. Islam emphasizes submission and ritual observance. Each approach creates different intellectual frameworks, different problem-solving strategies, different relationships to innovation and change, different forms of social organization. These differences help explain the statistical patterns we discussed in our previous episode. Communities organized around subjective frameworks, whether individual or communal, consistently demonstrate different intellectual and creative capabilities than communities organized around subjectless frameworks. In our next episode, we'll examine how these fundamental theological differences translate into practical approaches to education, ritual, and daily life. We'll explore how Islam's emphasis on orthopraxy creates different cognitive development than Judaism's and Christianity's emphasis on interpretation and transformation. How do different approaches to the divine-human relationship create different types of human development? What are the practical consequences of subjectless versus subjective frameworks? If you're interested in how theological frameworks create measurable civilizational differences, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share your observations about how different approaches to ultimate questions influence practical problem-solving in various societies. See you next episode, where we'll explore Islamic ritual thinking versus creative subjectivity.